Well, let me welcome everybody to this latest chapter in our Run.Vote.Work initiative. I'm Russ Feingold, the president of the American Constitution Society. And Run.Vote.Work is focused on countering election subversion and strengthening our representative democracy. This also includes, of course, to make our elected bodies more representative of the communities they serve. My favorite advice lately about running for office came at our convention. It's what Tennessee State Representative Justin Pearson said the other night at our convention. He said, the advice is run anyway. Run anyway. Whatever reason you have for not running, he said, run anyway. Now, ACS is nonpartisan. Our goal is not to recruit candidates for any one party, but to foster representative democracy broadly by encouraging more people to run. We need more people running for office, particularly for down ballot positions, including Secretary of State, State Attorney General, State Legislature, City Council, and School Board. You know, it's often these local offices that are having the most outside influence on our lives and on the direction of our communities and our country. And I'm sad to say, I watched the right wing and the conservatives figure this out long before we did. They figured out the importance of those offices and acted on it decades before we did, and now we're catching up. Whatever issue you care most about, these local offices have an influence on it. Now, this may be about the only subject that I really am an expert on, running for office. And let me just say a couple of things after having run for the state Senate 3 times and the U.S. Senate 5 times. First of all, I guarantee you, whatever happens, it's an amazing experience. Secondly, whether you win or lose, it's still an amazing experience. Winning is more fun than losing. I've done both of them, but it is a very worthwhile thing. And the relationships you make, however it comes out, will be of value and pleasure for you the rest of your life. The other thing I want to say is what you learn about all the different kinds of people in our world and what you learn about the economy and how things work when you run for office is completely different than being just in one field, because you cover the gamut and you learn a broad perspective. I want to tell you, whether you win or lose, it's going to make you a better lawyer, because when you practice law, if you've had that experience of knowing about how people perceive the world differently and different walks of life and different aspects of the economy, it's very, very helpful. And finally, it's so important to do this, as my colleague and friend, the late John McCain, said, it's an opportunity to think and do something bigger than yourself. It's an opportunity to give to your community. So I'm honored to be able to kick this off, and I'm going to turn it over now to our moderator, Jeanne Hruska, our Senior Advisor for Communications and Strategy at ACS, and she will introduce our panelists. Jeanne?
Thank you, Russ. And I want to thank our panelists for coming. And I want to thank everyone who's joining us today and everyone who will watch this video later on. For those who didn't come to our convention recently, we announced a new theme for ACS, and that is securing the promise of a multiracial democracy and defeating authoritarianism. Both of those things require more people to run for office. And so even though we're a nonprofit, we want to be a resource to folks who are interested in running for office, who have an inkling to run, but aren't really sure if they want to run and have a lot of questions about running. We can help with that. We have so many members in our network who have run, who are currently in elected office, who have run campaigns. So we really hope that this program will be an opportunity for you to see ACS as a resource as you make the big decision and as you go forward in running. And I'm so excited to have the experts that are our panelists today. One of them will be joining us late, but I will introduce her here at the top anyway. But starting with whom we have, Deborah Gonzalez. Thank you so much for joining us. She is District Attorney for the Western Judicial Circuit of Georgia. And Jaylin McClinton, thank you for joining us tonight. He is a former candidate for the Cook County Board of Commissioners in Illinois. And joining us in a few minutes will be Megan Pulsts, who was a former city council member of Pine Lake in Georgia. All right, we have lots of questions, but I also want to encourage folks who are watching this to ask questions in the chat. We'll try and get to as many as we can. Hopefully we'll also answer a couple as we move along. All right, Deborah, I'm going to start with you, and we're going to start at the very start of the campaign and kind of work our way towards election day. So I'll ask you just a broad question, which is what motivated you to run, and specifically for the office that you ran for?
So I've had 3 elections and 3 campaigns. And I start with that because my position now, which is DA, is not my first election or campaign that I ran. I actually started by running for state representative in the Georgia House of Legislators, and I won that. And because when you asked me about what motivated me to run, it was because after a certain election, I didn't feel that my representatives really shared the same values that I had. And I saw things that needed to be addressed and fixed in my community. And I wasn't seeing that my representative really thought that those were the things that they needed to work with. And so I decided then that I was going to run because my community needed somebody who shared their values. And so I did
So
run.
many people can identify with that. Just noting, like, I know I look at my elected representatives and go, why did they make that decision?
Yeah, and one of the first things was, one of my representatives actually voted for campus carry, which meant that they can now have firearms on the campus. And so Athens is the home of UGA. My husband is a professor. And that was very personal to me, that concern over his safety. And so that really was an impetus for me to sort of get in. I knew nothing about politics before I did this. I literally Googled, how do you run a political campaign? And I found some organizations to take training and who had, like these books of how-to guides, kind of a thing to find and just to learn what does it take. And I have to tell you, I took about 7, 8 trainings. The best training is just getting in and doing it. Because no matter all the great wisdom we are going to give you, your journey is going to be very unique to you. And there are going to be things that you face that we have never faced. And we can give you some guidelines, some things to look at. But at the end of the day, each of these campaigns is an individual journey.
Sounds like it can be summed up by saying you learn by doing. And so in addition to run anyway, it's a just run.
Mm-hmm.
I think we can overthink this a lot of the times. Jaylin, what made you decide to run for office?
Yeah, sure. I would say for me, I definitely agree with a lot of what Deborah said. And, I do think that a big part of it is just kind of like, the Nike advertisement, just do it. I think growing up in Chicago on the South Side, we are fortunate and maybe sometimes not so fortunate to have a wealth of Black leadership across the political spectrum, whether it's at the state level, the federal level, or even at the local level, like at Cook County or in the city of Chicago. And I think for me, at the time in which I decided to throw my hat in the ring for the Cook County board, it was at a time where at the age of 28 years old, I've been represented by the same person for my entire life. And that individual decided that she was no longer running for re-election. And I waited a little bit to see the type of candidate that would throw their hat in the ring. And after a while, I just felt that I could do a better job. And so ultimately decided to throw my hat in the ring to run for Cook County Commissioner in the 5th District. And I think for me, kind of leading up to that point, the biggest kind of factors that influenced my decision to run were, I am someone who firmly believes in public service. And I think it's important for candidates to understand their why. Why are you doing this? This is a very grueling, taxing experience running for office. And so you really have to kind of understand your why or why you're doing it. And also making sure that your family members and loved ones who are close to you understand as well, because they will be a part of this process too. I think beyond kind of identifying the why, I certainly participated in a number of activities that allow me to understand the nuts and bolts of campaigns, to ensure that I understood what to expect when it came to things like fundraising, when it came to things like door knocking, setting up the campaign filing, setting up, apparatuses to make sure that I was ethical along the way, because I was advocating for ethics on the campaign trail, because in Illinois, unfortunately, often more than not, we're plagued with candidates and elected officials who engage in corruption. And so, I think all of those foundational things and tools were helpful in my decision to run for public office. But I think more than anything about the decision-making process was really kind of, will I do it, won't I do it? And I would say for anyone who is thinking about running for office, you should do it, but you should also understand that through this experience, and I'm sure we'll talk about this more later, but you really learn who supports you and how they support you. And as people oftentimes always say, you learn who your real friends are.
I really enjoy your emphasis on the why, and I actually want to come back to that in a minute. But I also want to welcome Megan, who just joined us. Thank you so much for joining this event. And I'm going to put you on the spot right away and ask you what I just asked Deborah and Jaylin, which is, what motivated you to run, and to specifically run for the office that you did?
Absolutely. And I apologize for being late. I got caught in some traffic on my way to getting back to a desk. So I'm Megan Pulsts. I was a city council member in the smallest city in DeKalb County, Georgia. The city of Pine Lake, Georgia is just outside of Atlanta. And the reason I ran was I had, the first time I ran, I was in my third year of law school, and had just started getting involved in the city workings, and had volunteered on our tree board and on our city, some other planning committees work, and got a look at how a lot of the things were done in the city. And being a very small town, a lot of it's very volunteer run and very based in how, whoever has knowledge about something runs. So there was an awful lot of cut and paste laws that were written, that reading them from an attorney standpoint was a little bit mind-boggling. Internal inconsistencies and just contradictory clauses in different parts of like our zoning code was the one that really got me there. So feeling like my legal skills and knowledge of the legislative process could really help with cleaning some things up and increasing professionalism in the city that had basically been run like, my husband calls Pine Lake a homeowners association with delusions of grandeur. So it's a town of 750. So it's very, very small. And so part of it was just wanting to serve in a way where my skills could be put to use in a city that's very much full of artists and several scientists from the CDC, but not really any attorneys had ever served on council or as mayor before.
That's wonderful to hear. And I appreciate the emphasis on size, because I think when people think of running for office, you think of the really big positions that cost millions of dollars, and that's what's really intimidating. We always are trying to remind people of down ballot races that actually often have more impact on your day-to-day life. Jaylin, I want to come back to you thinking about the why, because we've been saying run anyway, but I'm also cognizant that there are reasons that people have in hesitating about running for office, right? You have that list where it's like, yes, run, don't run. And there's definitely concerns in the don't run column. And so I'm curious if you had a specific reason that was your reason for hesitating, if there was something that you were most concerned about, whether it was the fundraising, the exposure, whatever it was, what was the biggest concern and how did you overcome it?
Sure. I think that's a great question. And I think for everyone, it might be different. I think the biggest barrier for my campaign personally was that I am not someone who comes from wealth. And I think that unfortunately, the reality is that we need to get money out of politics, but as things stand right now, we need money to run for public office. And so because I don't come from wealth, I think the question was oftentimes, where's the money going to come from? But I think even beyond that, I always knew that I could run for office and I would be able to accomplish what I did. And, even though I didn't win, I think I always say sometimes you have to win to lose or lose to win, excuse me, because I think, some of the experiences that I've had to date, the people that I've met, right, I would not have had those experiences but for losing the race. It's nice to win, as Russ said earlier, but, I think in losing, you certainly win too. But I think, the finances was something that was a barrier. And then I think just the kind of confidence of, can I really do this? Because I think, as a candidate who was running during my third year of law school and being in a state and city that is founded on machine politics, I think there were a lot of people who kind of already had their candidate in mind. And so for me, dealing with that, it was kind of a lot of, can I really do this? Knowing what I'm up against with respect to the candidates who the machine had in mind, and also knowing that, I wasn't necessarily someone who could self-fund a campaign myself.
We're going to talk specifically about fundraising, because I know whenever I think of running for office, it is the thing that scares me the most. So Deborah, asking you kind of the same question, you've run multiple times. What is there a concern that keeps cropping up, or has it been different each time?
It's different each time. I mean, one of those elections was during COVID, so that was really interesting. How do you canvass and how do you get to potential voters when everybody's locked in or wearing masks? That changed the dynamic completely in that last election that I did in 2020, which was for the DA. But I think money is probably the biggest thing, right? If you've never done it before, it can be quite overwhelming to think about. And I had come, I'm Latina. And so my father, who's also military, had always said, if you want to do something, you should do it. You shouldn't ask anybody for help, right? You should be that. So to get over that in my own mind, that I was asking people to help me in this campaign, was also me sort of shifting the paradigm and understanding that I'm not collecting money to go on vacation, right? I'm collecting money so that I'm able to get a seat to do what it is that they want me to do as their elected official, right? So it's just really taking their money to achieve the goal that they want, which is to have an official in a position that they feel shares their values. But I did, if I can, wanted to address one of the questions that came up about this balance of family and campaigning, because I know that becomes a big barrier, especially for women when they start being concerned of, can I do this? Do I have the time? Especially the younger the children that they are, and if you don't have family around you, it is extremely important to have that support from your immediate family. And if you have a spouse or a partner, they have to be in it with you, even if they're not at the forefront. They still have to understand that they're going to be supporting you from the back, and there are times you're just not going to get home, right? And that conversation that you have with your family about, there's going to be some games you're going to miss, or some school plays or something like that, but it doesn't mean that you don't love them any less, right? And so having those really important conversations from the very beginning, and it's almost like this becomes a family decision. It's not just your decision, because it's going to affect all of them. And it's also going to be questions that you're going to need to answer. How much exposure do you want for your family, right? My husband is a very private man. I often joke when I bring him out every so often that yes, he does exist, because he's not one of those campaign spouses who is always there, right? That's our agreement. When I need a husband, he's there. When I don't need the husband, he could stay home and take care of the house and do the dishes and wash the laundry, right? But that's the arrangement that we have. In other partnerships, I've seen where the spouse is there all the time. They want to be there and want to be part of that, and are also part of the campaign. And I think you just have to have that conversation. What are you both comfortable in doing in that campaign? But understanding that if you do have a family, this is a family decision. You just can't ram it through to your significant other that you're going to do this no matter what they've said, because I've also seen divorces happen after elections, right? And those are really sad, and because it is a very stressful thing to go through, right? And it does test the relationship and how you guys interact with each other. So, when you have a family, when you have a significant other, you really do have to have that tough conversation at the beginning of what this means.
I really appreciate that honesty, and I get such a kick out of hearing about your husband. He really does exist, I promise you. That made me smile. But Megan, what are your thoughts on this? Was there a specific concern that stood out for you?
Again, I'm coming from the much more accessible level of things, so it's a lot less of the public scrutiny and public facing parts of it, and more it's very intimate running in a small town, I will say. You are looking at running for city council in a place where everybody, and not only do you know everybody, or most of the people, but everybody who you're talking to is like, oh, you moved into the Kincaid's old house, which is the owner from like 30 years ago. And my neighbor across the street had her baby shower in my living room for her daughter, who's a year younger than me. So there's a lot of people who've been there for a very long time. And so it's not just about a role or a very strong public policy position, but it's their homes and their livelihoods. And, do you fit in with what they want the city to look like in the future? And do you fit in with, where, do your thoughts on what needs to happen match with how they want the city to move forward? And so you become very, you're always on in a small town. People grumble about a pothole and you're like, oh gosh, that's my responsibility, isn't it? What should I be doing about that? So some of it is just, it's so intimate, and you're walking your dog and run into somebody and they're talking about what's going on. So that's the difference. I mean, I had less hesitation from any of that. There wasn't any real internet work. There wasn't really any campaigning in any of that type of way for what I did. It was all, in person. We had a few candidate forums, and, it was just knowing my neighbors and having been involved with the city before, in what I do. So I did have a conversation with my husband and say, is this something you're okay with? And he is also not particularly extroverted, to put it mildly. So, he was fine with it, but he was, again, like, this isn't this is not my thing. This is definitely your thing. But he was fine with it, and he knew that he wanted somebody intelligent running on city council as well. So he was happy with that part.
You bring up a different level of exposure. I think when we think of exposure in public office, you think of press exposure, but your notion of I can't even walk my dog without everyone knowing who I am, what position I hold. It's a different level of exposure to consider. But Megan, I'll stick with you just for this next one, and we'll go around again. This is the question that intrigues me the most, which is, when you make the decision to run, then what? What's the first thing you do? Because I think even when you make that decision, it's not obvious what the next step is. Is it filing paperwork? Is it recruiting volunteers? Is it fundraising? Do you set up a bank account in order to fundraise? What are those very early stages?
Well, again, at my level, pretty much none of those things. I filed, and I think it was an $80 filing fee. And I was actually at a conference in California, because the filing window was 4 days and had to be done in person, because it's it's like a business week, I think. And I was at a conference in California the week that it was going to be open. So I had talked to the city manager ahead of time, and I'm like, I know this is supposed to be done in person. Can I FedEx it to you? Because apparently it has to be dated and notarized at a certain time or within that filing period. So I did that, FedExed it over, and got my paperwork in, paid the $80 filing fee. And then it was just a matter of, talking to the other folks, I think I ran opposite the mayoral race my first time, and at the same time as a mayoral race the second time. So it's, paying the filing fee, making sure that the other people who are, running sort of know your interest in it. And then for me, there wasn't any real logistics because my total campaign outlay was, I think, $150 in making yard signs. So I just paid that. And I had 4 signs made up, and and I got like the right neighbors to put them in the yard. So it was like on the exits and the entrances to the town. And that was, so I'm again, the very smallest level, entry level political campaigning work. I did no campaign fundraising. I did no, mailings or internet or anything else. It was yard signs and just talking to people. And I did some door knocking, but that was it.
That's reassuring. It's not actually that massive of an undertaking. Go ahead.
I mean, I won city council. I lost the first time getting 118 votes, and I won my second election with 137 votes. So that's the scale we're looking at.
Hey, that is democracy in action. I love it.
It very much is.
We're gonna go up in size of office because I kind of like this was a very small undertaking. Jaylin, let's go to you. What were those very first steps you took after deciding to run?
Yeah, sure. So just to give everyone context, my district, the 5th district, had roughly 300,000 people in it. So it's almost like a mini congressional district, if you will, about half the size of a congressional district. And so at the moment in which I knew that I was going to run for the Cook County Board, it required a campaign filing at the state level. That also kind of required me to establish a P.O. box just because I did not want my personal address kind of listed on my campaign materials. In addition to that, I also needed to establish a bank account, identify a treasurer and a campaign committee chair. More often than not, the campaign committee chairperson is the candidate themselves. And so I served in that capacity for my Friends of Jaylin McClinton campaign committee. And then I identified a treasurer. And then if you're ethical, which I strongly recommend for candidates running for public office, you want to put together the back of house kind of compliance operations individuals to make sure that as you start to collect fundraising donations from individuals, that you are in full compliance for purposes of running for office. So I think the nuts and bolts of kind of the operational pieces were really important in Illinois. In terms of kind of exhausting resources, I mean, I definitely paid for my P.O. box, but in terms of kind of setting up the initial kind of parameters for how I would run for public office, I did not have to spend too much money. I also spent a little bit of time with a advertising firm developing my logo and having vision casting sessions with them to kind of talk through what that logo would look like. And then designated an official launch day, which I think really governed kind of on my social media platforms and via ActBlue, the tools that I would use to actually get my brand up and running and to encourage people to engage with my campaign committee.
Can I just follow up real quick on how you went about identifying the people that you recruited? Because it sounds like you had a team. Were those folks that you knew? How did you find those folks with that expertise?
Sure, it was a combination of both the individuals that I had knew or worked with previously, and then also bringing in new individuals into the fold. And so, yes, running the campaign that I ran, I did have a full suite of individuals who oversaw things like compliance, political, event planning, fundraising, et cetera. And so one individual in particular really believed in me, and that individual was a friend of mine, and he actually had worked on campaigns with me previously and a number of other campaigns at every level of government. And she actually came in to help me kind of establish the framework for what my long-term campaign would look like. And I think in the beginning, what I would say is, particularly for candidates who don't come from wealth and who want to be nimble, I think up until the point in which I actually formally filed my petitions, for a lot of that time period, I was my own campaign manager. And I say that to say that, right, I think, again, not coming from a background of, well, you have to be innovative about how you do things. And, you know, I had no problem kind of being out in the neighborhood, meeting voters and talking to them as I collected petition signatures, for example, because to me, these individuals had to vote for me anyway. So what better way to start that initial engagement than by going door to door to collect signatures to get on the ballot. And so I think that first kind of few months on the cycle, I was actually kind of serving as my own campaign manager, doing a lot of the background work that I knew was required on a campaign because I had volunteered for various campaigns at different levels prior to actually announcing a campaign of my own.
That's really helpful. Deborah, over to you on this question of the early steps, and maybe they were different depending on the position you were running for. So whatever you think is most informative for folks.
So the first time I ran, like I said, I knew nothing. So I was learning and making mistakes as I was learning as to what should go first. And you sort of start one way and then you realize, oh, you needed to do this paperwork. Well, let me go and do it. And as you take trainings, you start learning about other things that you should have, like, you know, an envelope that you should always have with to get donations with your address, you know, and these remittance envelopes. I had never heard of a remittance envelope. And then I figured, wow, this is a great way to fundraise. Every time you go, you leave somebody with an envelope and they can just put in a check or cash or whatever it is that they want to give you. But I also think, like in my first campaign, it was very volunteer run. It was a much more smaller scale, you know, and everybody was volunteers. By the time I got to my third campaign in DA, now I'm paying everybody a salary. We were at that point at $15 an hour, you know, and so I think it depends on what you're running for and how big it is. So my last campaign cost $300,000. So it's a lot different from that 125 that Megan, you know, did that outlay, but then I'm doing massive mailings, right? Because I have, you know, over 170,000 people that I'm trying to reach. So it's on a much larger scale in that. But I think with every time that you run, you learn how to do things and how to put them in order. And I know trainings sort of want to give you this checklist, and there are checklists out there. But, you know, sometimes you do it out of order and it's okay. It's not going to be the end of the world. It's okay, and you'll get through it. But I think the most important thing for you to consider is who are your team, right? And not just by those particular roles of campaign manager and fundraiser, but who's that kitchen cabinet support team who's going to be with you from the beginning to the very end, where you can go and cry and vent and do whatever you want. And they're going to say, we got you, you got this, go out there. You really have to have that team. That's extremely important. And the second most important person is going to be that campaign manager. And, you know, if you have a larger seat that you're running for, it's important to have that key person be somebody that you trust intimately, because they are going to be representing you when you cannot be there, right? I worked full time throughout each of these campaigns, and I could not be everywhere that my campaign manager could be. And I had to trust that this person knew my values and how I would answer certain questions and what kind of things I would want to be involved in or not. So when you're bringing your team together, don't be scared to have those hard conversations with these individuals. And I think sometimes when we just depend on our friends, sometimes not because they want to or there's any malicious intent, but they might assume things about you that's not really the way that you want your campaign to go. Or they might make certain decisions that you probably would not have made. And so when your friends take on a specific role in the campaign, you have to have that conversation that says, you're my friend, but now you're this role, and I need you to do this in this role, and not let the friendship be destroyed by that. And so I've had to tell, you know, good friends who wanted to help, in certain roles and tell them, no, I'm not going to hire you for that role, but you can definitely be a supporter and you can do this over here, but I cannot put you in that role. Our friendship means too much, and I just don't think it's going to work out.
That's a really hard conversation, I imagine, but it's such a valuable point. You brought up the $300,000 price tag, and so I want to turn to fundraising, and we'll start with you since I appreciate that you named the price. I think this is one of the hardest things to undertake, because people don't know how much they're going to have to fundraise, how much they're going to need initially. It's terrifying to think that you open up your contact list and just start calling your friends and mentors and relatives and begging for money. So what's your advice on fundraising? How did you go about doing it? And to Jaylin and Megan, if you're willing to say how much, we know Megan, it was $125, which is fantastic. I love that. Jaylin, defer to you on whether you want to specify how much you raised, but just to give people a sense of what we're talking about, again, because we think of, millions and millions and millions of dollars when we think of presidents and senatorial races. So it's helpful to kind of downsize this for smaller offices. But Deborah, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so some lessons that I'll share is, number one, don't make up stories for anybody, right? Because sometimes, since we know people will say, oh, they're having a hard time, they're not going to be able to give, I don't want to bother them, this kind of thing. And you'll be amazed at how many people really want to be asked. They really want to support you. They don't know how to. And so being able to give them different options on how to support you. So even though it might be a call for money, maybe there's something else they can do. Maybe they can do a meet and greet. Maybe they can, post something on social and share it with their friends. Maybe they can share that. So that's just one thing. Don't make up stories for people before you actually ask them. And then the second thing is, you have to ask. Do not assume that just because you put this Facebook post or you send, an email, that people are going to give you. What I've learned is that send the email, do the post, and then pick up the phone and call them. And more often than not, they're going to give you something because you called, right? But they get so many solicitations, especially, I run on a presidential year. So they're getting all of these really high level asks for these seats. And so you have to do that personal one-on-one and ask. That's really important. The other thing I learned is that I hate code calling. I hate call time. I hate that you give me a list of people and I have to go down. Give me a reason to call them, right? So I love, for some reason, I can do events. If I have an event coming up, even if it's a virtual event, even if it's a non-event event, okay? But if I have a reason to call them and say, hey, I'm having this event, will you be on the host committee? I'm having this event, can I put your name? Would you give X amount of dollars? That makes it easier for me because I feel that I'm not just selling myself as the politician, but I'm selling this event and this experience of democracy for them to participate in. And so those are just things that I've learned that work a little bit better, but you do have to ask people. That is the best way to get money, is by actually asking them. And don't be hesitant to ask individuals, who else should I talk to? And would you do an e-introduction for me so that it's not as much of a cold call? Right? But, this person's connecting you to this other person and this person's connecting you to this other person. And I think that's also an easier way, sort of that warm handshake, in order to get that next donation. And then the last thing that I will say is, make sure you thank all your donors. A handwritten note card makes a huge difference. And so one of the activities that I had for my volunteers was, we would have these thank you card get-togethers, right? And they would write out most of the language, and then I'd add a little something and sign my name. But that made a big difference to people, that they would get that little thank you from me.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate that reminder. I love thank yous and getting out the old-fashioned pen and paper. Jaylin, coming to you on this, Fundraising, lessons learned, the pluses, the minuses, and how you get it done.
Yes. So first and foremost, you do have to thank people. I say that after thanking 600 plus donors individually. It took me a little while to get through it, but I am proud to say that every single person who donated $1 or $1,000 or $6,000 to my campaign were thanked. I think that that is 100% something as a candidate that if you decide to run, you have to thank people. So just for awareness in my race, I raised in total in the ballpark of about $110,000 to $115,000 over the course of 8 months. It's something that I'm very proud of, particularly because, as I said earlier, I do not come from wealth. And on my day one as a candidate, I did not have that amount of money to spare. And so it really came down to, I think, effective communication that included a series of different tactics, including text messages, picking up the phone, which I think is the most effective, emails, and then using social media, primarily kind of direct action towards reaching out to people in my network. And so fundraising can be very daunting. I think particularly because I had helped other candidates do it prior to kind of doing my own call time, I didn't necessarily have the same kind of fears that I think we oftentimes see from people and candidates when they're running for office, because, you know, I knew what to expect. But I will say, I do agree with Deborah that, you know, you can't assume, I think, not only just about people seeing a post on Facebook, but I also think about people's capacity to give, right? Like you might be making assumptions about what someone can give you, and they may surprise you and give you more than what you thought they could give. And so I think it's important to, of course, do a kind of gut check to determine what people's capacities are. And you certainly can do that using tools like ActBlue, and there are other donation tools like Open Secrets to kind of see where people have given before. But I think it's also kind of critically important to let the donor kind of guide the conversation, because, you know, for me, of those 600 plus donors, I remember a lot of them. And quite frankly, I remember the first person who donated $1,000 to me. I remember the first person who maxed out to my campaign. I remember, you know, who my first donor ever was when I launched my campaign on November 30th of 2021. And so I think all of those things stick with you as you continue to progress, and win or lose, you're now building this Rolodex of people who you can rely on in the future. Because I think, you know, if people support you, they support you. And that's something that a lot of my donors made very clear. And I think, you know, for purposes of kind of building out that Rolodex, think of everybody. I think for me, I spent a lot of time digging into every nook and cranny of my life to really think about who supports me, who will be helpful, dating back to, you know, my kindergarten classmates all the way up to my law school classmates, which were most recent. And so I think you really have to do that cadence. And I think that's something that you could be doing now if you're thinking about running for office, spending, you know, 10 minutes here and there, putting together a master list of people, family, coworkers, colleagues, people you're involved with on various boards, and making sure that you're capturing everyone, and then just going in for it and actually asking the question of, you know, will you donate to my campaign? And I tried to say invest a lot, because I wanted people to understand that this was a mutual kind of effort. And, you know, it's not just a donation, but it's an investment in the progress that we want to see in our democracy, in our locality, et cetera, et cetera.
I like that word, invest. I'm going to take that from you for future fundraising efforts. Megan, do you have thoughts on this, on yard signs? I will say, as a tactic, I love yard signs. I just love posting them. I love putting them in the window. I love having them in my yard. But in terms of fundraising, do you have thoughts on this from a small campaign perspective?
I'm not sure how much I can contribute to this, just because we didn't have
Yeah.
you know, I don't think anybody who's run for city council or mayor has done any campaigning in any significant way. And yard signs are about as fancy as we've gotten. You know, the local community, the local neighborhood association does a candidate for them, and it's a very active, you know, semi-structured and semi-Q&A format for the candidate forum. And there's not a lot of fundraising that happens. You know, the entire city budget is $300,000 a year. So,
The cost of Deborah's campaign. That's amazing.
yes, you know, so, you know, but I guess my $125 did yield, this was less than $1 per vote that I got. So, you know, it's not a
Well,
bad return on that.
What I really enjoy about this is for folks who are terrified of fundraising, depending on where you live, there are offices where that's actually not going to be an issue. And so it's just a further reason to think down ballot, which is something ACS is constantly trying to encourage folks to consider. With the interest of time, I'm going to kind of combine a couple of questions. I also want to note that Jaylin has provided written answers to some of the questions in the Q&A, which I really, really appreciate. But one of the other big concerns that comes up, and it's been hinted at by some of the other questions, is exposure, right? One of them is exposure to family, but also exposure to self. In this day and age, between social media trolling, the number of elected officials who are receiving death threats, there is, I think, a lot of vulnerability that you take on by running for office and putting yourself out there. And so I would just love to hear from all three of you. And I won't actually pick on anyone. I would, if anybody wants to go first on this one, what your thoughts were on that, what your experience was in terms of the press and exposure. And then I want to incorporate one of the questions in the QA, which is, how do you feel your identity affected your campaign and maybe the outcome of the campaign? Were there any unlikely supporters or opponents? And I think this goes to that question of exposure, because in this country, identity absolutely affects how people receive you and what kind of response you get. Does anybody want to start with this?
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I think, you know, for me, as someone who ran as a third-year law student, and at the time being 28 years old, now almost being 30, I think, you know, of course, the era of being a young person consistently came up, and there was always this era of, oh, he's not qualified. And even at that point, I was finishing law school and had worked in government, et cetera, et cetera. But I think there was often an air. My community was predominantly Black and also senior. And so I think I oftentimes kind of found myself trying to overcompensate for, like, hey, I actually can do this job. And, you know, I think in addition to that, I think this is a great question, because for me personally, you know, not only was I running as a young person, I was running as a Black man, and also was running as a openly LGBTQ candidate. And so I had a lot of worries about, you know, how I would be perceived in a predominantly Black church-going community. And as much as we kind of acknowledge that Illinois is this inclusive space, you know, in my community, we still have a lot of work to do when it comes to inclusion and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so, you know, I think all of those things are kind of underlying issues throughout the process. But I think what Deborah said in the chat around having validators, I really think that's something that lent a lot of credibility to me, earning the endorsements of key elected officials, key advocacy groups. And I think more than anything, just showing up. I mean, I knocked at least 5,000 to 6,000 doors personally over the course of the 8 months when I was running for public office. And I think that spoke dividends in that outcome, right? I didn't win my race, but if you look at the precinct by precinct information in my race, I actually walked away winning my entire ward in the city of Chicago. And, you know, for me, the person who eventually won on election day, but in looking at that precinct level data, my neighbors, you know, voted for me. And I think that that's something that I will always be very proud to know, that, you know, my neighbors saw these other candidates and said, you know, no, Jaylin is our guy. This is our neighbor, and this is who, you know, we believe in. And so I think, having validators and people who could kind of dispel the errors of what someone or an opponent might be putting out into the universe is important. But then I also think being authentic and owning who you are as a person. When I was running, there were many people who said, oh, I don't think you should really kind of mention that, you're LGBTQ. And I kind of immediately pushed back and said, this is who I am. And I would have been the youngest commissioner and youngest Black person ever elected, as well as the first man of color openly LGBTQ elected to the Cook County Board. And then in another district, a 26-year-old actually, earned that title of being the youngest, the first openly LGBTQ person of color, et cetera, et cetera. And, he wouldn't have done that but for kind of believing in himself and running an authentic campaign. And we both did that. And so I think you have to be authentic. You have to know who you are and why you're running. And that's why that why is important. And then I think, just lastly, having the confidence to kind of push back, right? I think we talked about media as well. And there were a number of articles in my race, if you search my name or some of the other candidates, where the media are actually calling out some of the other candidates in my race for their proximity to corruption or bad acts. And as a candidate, I was someone to say, hey, look, this is an alternative choice. We don't have to have this or that because here I am. And so I think, being forthright about where you stand on the issues is critically important as well.
Thank you. I really appreciate that and the candor on that experience. Deborah, can I turn to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And Jaylin, it's been such a pleasure to just listen to you and hear your insights. And I know I'm enjoying this conversation. I'm sure that the other participants are as well. But, I have a very interesting experience here because Georgia, when it looks at identities, especially racial identities, it's mainly been sort of Black and white, right? And I'm Latina. And so, for many people, that means I'm an other. I don't fit in either one. And I was actually told by a very experienced politician that I couldn't win in Georgia because I was other. So I am the only Latina district attorney here. And, the thing that I have to deal with when you talk about exposure and media pushback, it does, connect with my identity of being a Latina, of being a woman of color, of being different from any other DA who was actually in my seat, but also being, I call myself a progressive DA, a DA who wants to reform the criminal system that we're in, and that leads to its own pushback. So I can be very proud to say that the Georgia legislature actually passed a law trying to get me out. It takes effect in July, so we'll see if I'll be back in this seat next year. But that when Jaylin says pushing back and owning who you are, that's on all levels. That's just not your race and your gender and your sexual preference. That's also in your beliefs and your platform and why you ran and why people actually elected you. And, there is this idea of people don't really like wishy-washy politicians, right? They don't like people who are just going to say whatever they have to say so that they get the right vote later on. What they want are people who are going to stand on their principles and actually stand for something and stand by what it was their platform was. And that's a hard thing to do when we're talking about racial identities, when we're talking about gender identities, when you're talking about reform, being a reformist prosecutor in this system. There's a lot of pushback to that, and that's happening all over the country. So when you talk about media and the exposure and the negativity, don't read the comments. I know that's easy to say, but really don't read the comments. Don't read the newspapers. Have somebody on your campaign team read that. And then if there's something that they have to tell you, they can tell it to you in a nicer way than what those trolls are going to tell you. But don't let that get into your headspace. And so you really do have to be disciplined to say, no, I'm not going to go there. I need to focus on the work and doing that campaign. But there is nothing like being your authentic self when you're doing this kind of work, because it's too much trouble to try to be something else. And you can't be everything to everybody, right? There's this 80-20 rule. So 40% of the people are going to love you no matter what you do. 40% of the people are going to hate you no matter what you do. And there's this 20% in the middle who's persuadable. And that's where you're going to focus your campaign and your messaging. You're going to keep your base, but they're going to be with you no matter what. You got to look at what are those in the middle thinking about and what will sway them. It may be a particular issue, maybe a stance. You know, there are many people, there are one issue voters, and you know, that's it. If it's gun control, it's gun control, that's it, right? That's all that they need to know from you. And so you need to know the type of voters that you have in whatever area it is that you're running in, but you have to be true to yourself. This is too hard to try to pretend to be something that you're not and do this work.
I love that. And I've heard Russ say that of tell the truth. If for no other reason, it's the easiest thing to remember. And that's true with your authentic self, right? Be who you are, because it's also who you are. It's the easiest thing to do. Can I just follow up with you, Deborah, real quick on the progressive label? Because that has been a hot topic as of late. You know, we had a moment where progressive DAs, like that was the trend, and a lot of them were coming into office, and there's been just such a backlash against progressive DAs. Can you just talk about your experience, like both running as one and the benefit of it, and then the backlash that you're experiencing right now?
Yeah, so thank you. So, you know, we experience, and I'm proud to call myself a progressive DA, but to me, a progressive DA means that we actually are looking at every single decision that we make, and we're trying to answer it with what is in the best interest of justice. And that also means what is in the best interest of our community. And the way that that question has been answered in DA offices for many generations is not at all what the community needs now. So there's also debate over whether there can actually be a progressive DA in there. But to me, you know, progressive means we're looking forward, we're doing reform, we understand the consequences of the decisions that we make, and we're very thoughtful when we make those decisions. So there is a cultural shift for that. And yes, it is a movement. It's not just a couple of individuals. It started out with about 14 in 2016. And right now there are over 70 progressive prosecutors, DAs around the country who accept that label and call ourselves that way. And I think the backlash is because we signify a change, and the movement is growing and our numbers are growing. And the bigger that we get, the more backlash there is, because this is different than the status quo, right? We are really coming from what does the community want in terms of justice, and how does the community define that? And they're defining it by a new type of prosecutor that they are electing. And as we see a shift in just the political arena about these issues of gun control and crime and restorative justice and juvenile justice and ending the school to prison pipeline, all of these things that require us to look at, you know, the causes of crime, like mental illness and substance abuse, instead of just saying that this person is a criminal. What are the underlying causes of this activity and conduct, and how can we then address those causes to bring down the crime and actually make our communities sustainably safe, not just for that moment where you take them out of sight and out of mind, but sustainably safe, because they're going to come back, right? 95% of individuals who are incarcerated are returned back to their communities, and we have to figure out a better way to accept them back and a better way to prepare the community to accept them back. So to me, that's the essence of prosecution, is that you're looking way beyond just that one decision that you're going to make, and that you really do want a future where individuals are rehabilitated and there's restoration, and we have a much more fair and just system across the board.
I appreciate that. And it reminds me, for folks who weren't at our convention, at our welcome dinner, Sherilyn Eiffel spoke. And this was a lot of what she talked about, was this backlash, that what we're experiencing right now is a massive nationwide backlash to the progress that we've made. And so it was a reminder of the progress that we've made, and that what we're encountering is a backlash. And to treat it as such, it really frames the issue. Megan, I wanted to come to you. I know we're running out of time, so I really appreciate everyone who is staying on for just a few more minutes. But I do want to get your thoughts on this, on the question of exposure, and especially your level of exposure, which is like, I have to go to the grocery store and I may get stopped by 10 constituents about stop signs. What was that experience like?
I mean, I use the word intimate because it really is like the hardest thing I had to do every year was set the millage rate for property taxes. We're a very small town. We have a very small commercial district. And that meant that we relied on residential property taxes for all of the city services that were provided. And so every year we had to balance a responsible budgetary income level with what are we doing to our neighbors, and is this going to have an effect on, or what kind of effect it's going to have on our neighbors. Like I said, the woman across the street who had her baby shower in my living room is retired, and she's a retired teacher. She has a very fixed income and very limited means, and increasing property taxes is a very direct effect on her. And so those things, and it's not just the budget is the budget and this is what we got to do. And it's, we're talking about very real dollars to people who are living across the street from you. So that's challenging. I'm sorry I lost my connection. I did want to briefly talk about the identity issue, simply because it's something you have to know going in where you are and about your district. So like I had, in Pine Lake, I had sort of the opposite experience. I'm a white woman. I joke that I live in Gayberry. So most of the 8 years I was in office, I was one of an all-female leadership team. Half of the women were LGBTQ identified, but our entire leadership team was, but also our entire administrative team, our police chief, our judge, our solicitor, our the defense attorney that we had on contract, everybody was female, which was unusual. So we did have some exposure in a negative way because we had this documentarian come in and do a documentary that was supposed to be about the female leadership and how we were doing things a little bit differently, because there is a lot more discussion and a lot more compromise, except that she wasn't able to sell that documentary, so she turned it into something different. And basically got as a bunch of backwards racists who pretended to be progressives because our traffic court had lots of minorities in it. Personal take is that person has never been to a regular traffic court before and doesn't understand how they work. So essentially treated us like predators for being the only people, because we were the only court she'd ever been to, I think. But so there's that exposure, and that was pretty upsetting, just to have, you signed releases for a documentary and we're told one thing and then it got completely turned around. And I guess that's something that you should probably anticipate if you're going in and talking to people who are going to do something that might not be entirely in your control, is that they can change what you've said and change the words you've used to fit the agenda that works for them later, and something that will sell for them in whatever the climate is at that point. So there's that. The other part of that is that I can't run for higher office where I live, because I live in South DeKalb County. And so if I were to run for state legislature, either state house or state senate, the vast majority of the people who I would be campaigning for are Black. And the last round of campaign postcards and stuff that went out were very, very racially charged. They moved some districts around, and basically there was a white woman who had been representing us, and the campaign paperwork that went around was, she's not one of us, type of thing, which was a little bit sad because she was very competent and knew how to do a lot of things. But at the same time, I can't be mad about a district that's going to be, represented by a Black person because it's majority Black people. I can't, that's not a problem. But it is also one of those, I'm not going to throw away money or effort into a campaign that I know is fruitless. So I would not be running for state legislature where I live. But, I might haven't ruled out running for judge or something like that, that is more a more broad perspective. So know where your jurisdiction is and know what it looks like, and try to be realistic and honest about that, is my perspective as far as identity and exposure.
Thinking of the documentary, I think we could do a standalone program about dealing with the press when you decide to run for office. But I realize we've gone over. I want to thank each and every one of you. Thank you so much for joining this panel. This has been just a joy to talk with all of you. I hope it's been useful to attendees. And for folks who joined us, if there are other resources that we can be helpful with, if there are other panels like this on specific topics, like maybe handling the press, let us know and we'll see what we can do about putting those on. But for the moment, I hope everyone has a wonderful and safe evening. And thank you so much again to our panelists for joining us tonight.